Welcome to Chapter 23, Part 3, as we take a look at William Howard Taft's and Woodrow Wilson's administration during the Progressive Era. When we look at Taft, one thing that kind of sticks out is that he kind of had favored free competition, business competition. Thusly, he not only pushed for lower tariffs, but he was also known to break up large businesses as he busted more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt. However, he didn't have the same belief as Roosevelt that government could kind of reform and change things. Thus, he kind of left it up for that free business competition. But at the same time, he also was more likely to support business leaders rather than labor when it came to disputes and kind of stood against unionization. We'll take a look at other issues here that came up during Taft's one term as president. And it's actually in Taft's administration that we kind of see a split in the Republican Party over the issue of tariffs, something that we've been talking about throughout most of the United States history. You have kind of the protectionist feelings or conservative feelings of some Republicans for higher tariffs, but then you have the progressive wing of the Republican Party that want to try to lower the tariffs. And what's eventually passed to try to please both sides is the Payne-Aldrich Act of 1909. Now, these rates were higher than what the House had proposed, but it had lowered it from previous tariffs to a more kind of moderate rate. So it was meant to try to be somewhat of a compromise. But what it does do is kind of show the beginnings of the split of this Republican Party. Another issue that kind of caused a rift, even though Taft, protected conservation efforts, was the Balinger-Pinchot Affair. Chief Forester Gifford Pinchot withdrew lands from being sold, thus trying to conserve more land. It couldn't be used for like digging for coal or drilling for oil or anything like that. But Richard Ballinger, who was Secretary of Interior, actually offered to sell some of this land, especially up in Alaska, and sold it to kind of mine for coal, and other resources. Eventually, as Pinchot tries to expose this issue and tries to get Taft to conserve this land, Taft basically fires him, which is within his right to be able to do that as president. And it's kind of a setting a controversy as to how much land should be sold and preserved or conserved for future use. And it's just another issue that will rise up, leading people to try and persuade Teddy Roosevelt to maybe throw his hat in the ring and run for president again in 1912. Because we have this split forming in the Republican Party, and Roosevelt kind of grows uneasy with some of the dealings that Taft is, kind of working with, or changes that he's making, and therefore Taft kind of is getting himself caught up in different issues, even though he's dealing with some of the problems that Roosevelt either kind of ignored or just kind of pushed aside while he was president. But these things were kind of beginning to rear their head, and Taft was trying to deal with them. At the same time, however, Taft does continue the kind of push to regulate railroads and other utilities, and what we see is the Mann-Elkins Act is passed, which kind of allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to set railroad rates and regulations, but it also expanded its power by placing the telephone and telegraph companies under the control of the ICC as well. And so if we fast forward to the election of 1912, we see that the Republicans do nominate Taft again to run for re-election. And as he has support of kind of the more conservative Republicans, the progressive wing had been pushing for and got Roosevelt to run for president once again. And he does so under the new Progressive Party, which becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. And Roosevelt puts forth his plan, kind of which becomes known as New Nationalism, the belief that the federal government should kind of get involved in business, It could regulate and help promote a healthy economy. Federal regulations would help provide for fair labor practices and business competitions, and also want to try to replace wasteful competition with kind of more efficiency. Again, believing that in a strong president and government to try to bring forth reforms and kind of promote this social justice movement of the progressive era. But on the flip side, the Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson and his belief of what becomes known as New Freedom. Now, Wilson was more of a states' rights Democrat. He wanted a free economy, and more business competition, kind of less regulations. He wanted to kind of restrain big business and government at the same time. And to do so, he wanted to try to decrease tariffs and kind of limit the role of what federal government should be doing. And therefore, with the split in the Republican ticket because of the Bull Moose Party and Roosevelt, it opens the door for a Wilson and Democratic victory. In fact, Wilson calls a special session of Congress after his inauguration, in which he actually appears before Congress, the first president since John Adams to do so in 1801. He then proceeds to try and get Congress to lower the tariffs, which is something that had split the Republican Party. And with some encouraging and maneuvering on Wilson's part, he's able to get Congress to pass the Underwood tariff, which is the first kind of bill to really cut the tariff rates in over 19 years, and it cut them by 15%. But at the same time, to make up for that lost revenue, the act also provides for a graduated income tax, something that the newly enacted 16th Amendment allowed for. And obviously, the income taxes we pay today are a much higher rate than the 1% tax that was on individuals and companies that made more than $4,000 a year back then. But the greatest measure he gets passed is one that will reform the banking system, and it is known as the Federal Reserve Act. Now, this act attempted to try to establish a stable currency, and yet one that was flexible. And it did so by kind of creating a blend of a public-private control of this new banking system, which would control the kind of the value and how much currency was in circulation. And it kind of regulated this by controlling the interest rates. The lower they put the rates, the more likely people were to borrow money, and therefore more money that would be in circulation. Or if they raised interest rates, that would cause people to have to pay more for money they borrowed, thusly limiting how much money is kind of being circulated and how much goods people are buying. So even though there hadn't been a bank in the United States since Jackson's killing of the second bank in the U.S., the Federal Reserve does kind of reform the banking system within the U.S. Yet another measure passed during Wilson's administration is the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act we've talked about before. Now, this Clayton Antitrust Act tried to outlaw unfair trade practices, something you'll read about a little bit more in your book, but it also made company leaders personally responsible for violating these antitrust laws. But at the same time, this act did protect unions, saying that they weren't conspiracies against business, and even going further by outlawing court injunctions and kind of acknowledging lawful strikes. And so you kind of see this Wilson administration with this act, siding on the side of labor and unions, something that will the unions will use in the future to kind of strengthen their position. However, even though some important legislation was passed under Wilson's administration, under the ideas of his new freedoms, he did block child labor and female suffrage because he thought that these issues should be left to the states. His administration was also very kind of segregated in nature, and he doesn't, try to advance the rights of civil rights. But we do see kind of a move from this new freedom to Roosevelt's new nationalism, partially due to the outbreak of World War I, partly because Wilson wanted kind of more Southern support, but also looking forward, we see the election of 1916 coming up, and eventually he will support labor, women's suffrage, increased taxes on the rich, and banning child labor, as well as providing for workers' comp for government jobs, pushing for 8-hour days. And he really does kind of start to take on some of those reforms that Roosevelt had pushed for before. But we'll take a further look at Wilson's administration and the outbreak of World War I in our next episode.